Mindfulness. Lindsay Fauntleroy, thank you for being with us on this Good Friday.
Hey, Lurie, thank you so much for having me back.
It is a pleasure. It's funny, you're here on a Good Friday, and we didn't plan it this way. It just so happens that we have you coming on days that are tied to certain changes in the moon, right? When we planned out this calendar, it was for what is it, the full moon and the new moon? What days are you
Full
here
moon and
on?
new moon Fridays. That's right.
And it just so happens that when you have a schedule that's based on full moon and new moon Friday, you are going to end up showing up on a Good Friday because, again, as I was saying on the other side of the break, it just so happens our Easter calendar is actually tied to an astrological, and an astronomic calendar, astronomy calendar. Yeah, that's what I want to say. And so we have so many examples of the way that our practices sort of fuse together and create this sort of amalgamation of beautiful opportunities for us to grow and to thrive. And yet, Lindsay, it's sometimes, even though, regardless of our religious practices, regardless of whether you meditate, chant, go take a walk in nature, go to a prayer closet, whether you pray in English or pray in tongues, doesn't really matter
All of the
because
above.
regardless, all of the above, right? Some of us are doing all of the above. Sometimes, no matter what our religious practice, we can end up still using language in ways that are self-defeating and that take the power out of whatever religious practice we are connected to. And you have this concept of disclaimers that you always advise people to not to give into. So can you talk with us about some of the ways that, regardless of our religious traditions, regardless of whether you're celebrating whatever you celebrate in this weekend, maybe you just celebrating that it's Friday, and thank God it's Friday is as close to a religious practice as you get. But can you talk with us about how sometimes our language, regardless of our spiritual practice, really ends up creating a reality that our spiritual practices absolutely do not want for us, but which we are creating through the words that we speak?
Yeah, I think a great way to ease our way into this conversation, I think during your moment of gratitude today, when you were talking about, a plant doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't apologize for existing. The birds don't apologize for existing. That energetic is really alive for us this season when we look at like kind of an indigenous calendar. We're in what we would call the wood element. And the wood element is about self-actualization and defining ourselves and being able to take up space. And
Mm.
so what I'd love to share are some strategies that I've seen over and over again that help us to take up more space and to not apologize for our existence, basically. I used to do a lot of work doing executive coaching and executive training. And these would be some of the things that would come up over and over again in terms of not feeling heard, not feeling respected, not feeling
Mm.
like they were making the moves that they wanted to make in their career. So we started looking at language as one of those ways where it's like, okay, how are you sabotaging yourself by how you show up in the room and how you show up in the
Mm.
space?
And self sabotage is something that we can end up doing in ways that we don't. I mean, obviously, no one plans to. I don't think anyone plans to self sabotage. That's not the goal. You work hard for something. You put your all into it. You do your best to try to show up as powerfully as you can. How would somebody who's committed to something, who is seeking something, trying to manifest something, how is it that they would engage in practices that end up sabotaging themselves without even knowing it?
Well, I thought of about 10 different ways that are all pretty subconscious. It's all habits, right? The way we speak, the way we move through space. Some of it is what we learned from watching the adults navigate spaces when we were growing up. Some we just internalized moving through school, what worked and what didn't. So I have my top 10 ways that we
Mm.
self-sabotage through our language. So the first one that I'll share is over apology. And
Huh.
by over apology, I mean apologizing for something that you are not guilty or culpable of. So
Hmm.
I'm going to ask everyone to channel their inner Beyonce or Demi Lovato or whichever artist that's talking about sorry, not sorry. The over apology comes in. So I'll give a great example. This happens all the time. Someone knocks into you and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry," but they knocked into
Mm.
you. So what are you exactly apologizing? Are you apologizing for being in the space? Are you apologizing for having a body? Are you apologizing for being? And
Mm.
particularly for communities of color, particular for people who descend from a lineage of oppression, that apology for taking up space is not only something that is habitual, but is sometimes expected. So someone will knock into you and look at you like, oh, well, what are you doing here? Wait, I was here first. I was walking down the sidewalk. What are you?
I was owning my space.
I'm
You moved
owning my
in.
space. I don't have to apologize for that. So that's one example, but also it can show up in whenever we're in a place of conflict with another person and we initiate the apology, but we weren't necessarily the one with the transgression, but we're making an effort to keep the peace. And so
aren't we supposed to do that? Like, I was always taught, again, here goes my indoctrination again. I was taught that, if there is a conflict, be the bigger person, and you should apologize even if you don't feel like you've done something wrong, because it always takes two to tango, and it can't be that you're completely innocent. So surely you must apologize for something. How does that square with what you just said?
Well, I had a really great therapist who used to say, we are each 100% responsible for our 50% of the problem.
Oh.
So yes, it does take two to tango. If there's a conflict, 9 times out of 10, we are both responsible for our part. And that is absolutely appropriate to apologize for. If you overstepped, if you spoke out of turn, if you misconceived, whatever it is that you did that is contributing to the conflict, bring self-awareness to apologize for that. But more often than not, we're not apologizing for our part. We're apologizing for the circumstance. We're apologizing for the conflict. We're apologizing for the discomfort that comes up when there is conflict. And that's where we can maybe dial it back a little bit and make sure that our apology is really rooted in our own actions, as opposed to apologizing for someone else's feelings, which we have no control over. Apologizing for someone else's mistake. Again, we have no control over that. And making sure our apology is warranted.
I was thinking in that first example where we were apologizing for taking up space, and I was at a store, and I was at the store after having read a number of people's experiences with white women who did not see them. So these were Black women and Black men who were saying, I was standing right here, and this white woman, and the race of the person who did it is important for the context. This white woman, or white man, but the folks I was reading about were complaining a bit more about women in this context. But this white person just acted as though I was not physically there. Maybe they didn't see me, but I knew they weren't blind. They didn't have a walking stick. There was no service animal. They weren't with anyone. They weren't just ambling about, unable to see. They literally saw me and decided I was not important enough to say, excuse me. They decided that after seeing me that I was going to assume the need to move. And so after having read some of these things, I was like, okay, so I'm not going to do this, because I've remembered some experience. I was like, I'm not going to do this no more. I'm in a store, clothing store. I have my cart, because it's, a small little space you're trying to navigate around. And the woman is aiming at me, and I haven't said anything. I see her in my periphery, and I'm still looking through the items that I'm looking through. And she frustrates, clears her throat as if I'm the problem. And I keep looking because I ain't heard excuse me yet, right? And so right now I'm mad. I'm like, I'm not moving. I don't see you at all. I don't see you in my periphery. I don't see you but it becomes this silent battle where I'm like, I know this bitch is not trying to force me to move without saying excuse me. She finally says, excuse me, in a rude tone. And I looked at her, I'm like, oh, were you standing there? Had you said, excuse me, earlier, I would have been happy to move for you, but I didn't hear you say that. And it was this awkward moment where I was like, oh, snap, this is it. This is what they were talking about. She literally expected me to accommodate her unspoken need to move out of her way. And she had no regard for the fact that I was perfectly able to own the space that I was standing in. I know it's a small example, but it really pissed me off.
I think it's not a small example. I mean, I think that when in the dialogue, in the growing dialogue around white fragility, what you just said around the expectation that a Black woman will tend to the unspoken needs of another person is very much in the psyche of America consciousness that we're trying to shift. So these small moments become big moments. And especially when we understand that our senses are at the service of our consciousness. And by that, I mean what we take in, what we see with our eyes, what we process is at the service of our paradigm of our worldview. So I had a similar situation where I was sitting in a co-working space, which is supposed to be relatively quiet because it is a co-working space. And a family came in, a non-Black family came in, and the little kid, who must have been 3 or 4, was like, "Oh, wow, there's nobody in here." And I'm like, "Wait, excuse me, sir, ma'am, I am sitting here. Hello, you can see me." So I don't think it's a
Literally right
small
here in front of you.
thing.
And that was a little kid who was able to say that, to see you and then say, "There's nobody here. I'm looking at you, but I don't see you."
To not be
Ooh.
corrected on that was an even bigger thing. So again, it's not a small thing. It's a symbolic thing.
Yeah.
But
So
that
over apologizing. Yeah, that's something that I don't feel like I'm very much victim of that, but I have definitely seen a willingness in my own life to apologize for things that I didn't actually do. And part of it is in response to this idea, well, you got to apologize for something, but now I can apologize for 100% of my 50% of the contribution to this problem.
There
Thank you
you
for
go.
that.
That has been a helpful word of advice that I've been living with for a minute.